Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I'm going to do something really special, folks. I'm going to debut the public debut of my reading glasses for this introduction. So thanks for being with me on this milestone. This is one of the program highlights of the year, truly, for the Dole Institute. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Audrey Coleman, and we're so pleased to have this wonderful cadre of folks here to present our evening's debate on the draft. The Counselors is a cross between a debate and a mock trial and has become a Dole Institute favorite. Before I pass to our student moderator, Abby Clements, who's one of our Student Advisory Board leaders, I want to share a little bit of the background on the program and recognize a few key folks that are with us this evening. Going back to our records, I think this program started in 2008, so this has been going on for a long time at the Dole Institute, and a lot of you are fan favorites of this program. So it started out as neutral ground, and the moderator originally was none other than legendary broadcaster Bill Curtis. Our program is now called The Counselors, and it's involved to incorporate student participation. Subjects that this program has addressed have pertained to military strategy, criminal justice reform, human rights and the death penalty, technology and energy policy, and Supreme Court term limits. Tonight, as I mentioned, the counselors will address the question, should the draft be reinstated? This is going to be the first installment of the counselors program this year, and I want to be sure and recognize someone without whom this program could not have been possible, Kevin Benson. Thank you so much. Kevin has been a fellow of the Dole Institute since 2011, and he made extensive contributions to developing the panel and the topics this evening. So thank you so much, Kevin. So mark your calendars for Thursday, April 24th. We are going to have the second installment of the counselors, and we are going to involve some wonderful students in that program as cross-examiners. The topic is to be determined, but you won't want to miss this presentation. Will involve not just KU Student Advisory Board leaders, but also students at Washburn University, and we are so lucky that those students are with us in the audience this evening. I want to recognize you folks, because we are so excited to see you present to us in April. So I'm going to call your name, and you can stand or wave, okay? So from Washburn University, we have Ryan Peterson and Janira Silva. Thank you both for being here. From representing the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, we've got Cass Casmus, Ava Levin, Jaspreet Kaur, and Harini Srikanth. Please stand up. Okay. We can't wait to see what you do in the spring. These students will be mentored in the coming months by our counselors. We look forward to bringing you all together as a community. And lastly, before we get started, I want to be sure and thank Pedro Irigonegaray and Ed Duckers, who of course are our counselors this evening. They're extraordinary not only in their own profession, but as colleagues, but as mentors to these wonderful aspiring jurists. When I mentioned back in 2021 that I'd like to incorporate students into this program, they didn't hesitate to do it and accept the mantle of mentor. And Pedro even said, let's invite our friends at Washburn University to participate. So thank you so much, Pedro, for making that possible. It means so much to us for obvious reasons here at the Dole Institute to connect with you folks at Washburn and to build a community around our shared Dole legacy. At the Dole Institute, we have fellows and visiting fellows that engage not only in public programming that the community can appreciate, but also these fellows give significant time and effort to mentoring our students. And Ed and Pedro have both spent so much time over the last couple of years doing that with our students, and so tonight I'm pleased to honor and recognize them both as visiting fellows of the Dole Institute of Politics. So if you will please join me in thanking them and recognizing them as new visiting fellows. All right, before I hand it over to Abby, I want to plug a couple of programs at the Dole Institute. Next Wednesday at 4 o'clock, we'll have our National Kansas panel, postmortem on the election. So that's at 4 o'clock next Wednesday, November 20th with John Shorman. That event will be over in Simon's Media Room. And then on December 11th in the afternoon, in time to be determined, but we will reconvene for our National Post-Election Conference panel featuring my predecessor, Director Emeritus Bill Lacey, and Jerry Seib, also a visiting fellow. We have a fantastic panel coming together for that event. You won't want to miss it, so join us here at the Dole Institute or online. All right, Abby, are you ready to lay out the ground rules for us this evening?
Yes, I am.
Okay, all right, I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, thank you for that lovely introduction, Audrey. Before we begin, I just kindly ask that everybody please silence their cell phones at this time. And welcome to this latest installment of The Counselors. The Counselors is a courtroom-style debate over an important issue, and this year's topic is, should the draft be reinstated? I'm going to now introduce our participants. The affirmative case will be advocated by our counselor, Pedro Irigonegaray. Mr. Irigonegaray is an attorney and partner at Irigonegaray, Turney, and Revenaugh. The affirmative case's expert witnesses are Dr. William M. Raymond, Jr., assistant professor at the Department of Command and Leadership at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and Kevin Benson, a veteran and director of the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The negative case to tonight's resolution will be argued by Counselor Ed Duckers. Mr. Duckers is a partner at Stoel Rives LLP and the head of the firm's litigation practice in California, as well as a member of the firm's executive committee. The negative case's expert witnesses are Steve Leonard, Assistant Area Director for Management and Entrepreneurship in the KU School of Business, and Deborah Shefford, Professor of History at Park University in Parkville, Missouri. The rules of the counselors are as follows. Each counselor will present their case and must follow the time constraints for each set of arguments and cross-examination of the witnesses. We have our timekeepers here on both sides who will hold up cards letting each side know how long they have left for time. First, each side will have 5 minutes for their opening statements. Then, each counselor has 24 minutes to ask their expert witnesses questions to build their case. First their affirmative, and then the negative case. During cross-examination, the opposing counselor will have 16 minutes in total to cross-examine the opposing side's expert witnesses. They may choose to split up this time however they would like, and the timekeepers will let them know how much time they have left. Lastly, each counselor will have 5 minutes for their closing statements. Counselors, when your time is up, please conclude your speech in a timely manner. Now, without further ado, we will begin the program. I welcome Mr. Irigonegaray for the affirmative to make the opening statements.
Thank you, Your Honor, Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be here once again with you. This evening, I represent the affirmative regarding the question as to whether or not the draft should be reinstated. I believe that each of us has great love for our nation. We all wish to protect it. Our nation's safety is protected by our Constitution and those that defend it. The military today is composed of volunteers. They serve honorably and have done wonderful work on all our behalf. But it's a very tiny percentage of the population. A very tiny percentage. And those individuals should not be alone. They should not be from a very clear segment of social economic class in the United States. We believe, and my witnesses will testify, that shared responsibility is necessary for our defense. First, because of the national security needs. A draft will ensure that sufficient military personnel is available in case of a national emergency. And all we need to do today is to look around and consider the dangers we face all over the world, whether in the Middle East, China, other parts of Asia, Latin America. It's a dangerous world. Secondly, shared responsibility. A draft would spread the burden of military service more evenly across society rather than relying on the volunteer force. Deterrence and readiness. A well-prepared military with personnel trained and ready at a moment's notice would serve as a strong deterrent to those that may consider being our enemies. Increased preparedness for unexpected threats. We are in an unpredictable world. I am concerned about our safety. Having the draft increases our safety. It doesn't diminish it. And finally, there is a positive benefit to having a draft. By bringing together individuals of every race, every social economic class, every faith, we would work together as a group promoting what is at this time greatly needed in our nation, which is greater understanding of one another, greater participation with one another, promoting brotherhood and sisterhood, providing service to our nation. We will present direct testimony from Dr. Benson and my witness, the Honorable and excellent Professor Raymond, Bill Raymond. These individuals are both graduates of the West Point Military Academy. Their credentials are impeccable. These individuals have dedicated their lives to the military and the protection of the United States. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the presentation of her case.
Thank you, Counselor.
Your Honor, Executive Director Coleman, my dear friend Pedro, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, it is my great privilege and honor to be here tonight on this program. Over 50 years ago, on July 1st, 1973, the United States abandoned the draft and moved to an all-volunteer military. That followed the highly unpopular, completely arbitrary military draft and perhaps more unsettling draft lottery in use during the Vietnam War, which did nothing, really, to eliminate any sorts of social inequities. Interestingly, the move to a volunteer military was not spearheaded by politicians or generals. Rather, it was spearheaded by renowned conservative economist Milton Friedman, who first raised the concept in his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, and led the charge for the all-volunteer military on the Gates Commission. Friedman's arguments for the all-volunteer force generally followed three lines of reasoning. Number one, it is immoral to conscript men in a free society. Number two, the economic cost of conscription, especially on the middle and lower classes, is greater than any benefit. There are no cost savings from a draft. What happens with a draft is you shift the cost of military service from those most able to pay to those least able to pay. And three, the constant turnover of conscripts make it difficult to develop the skills and professionalism necessary for a technologically advancing military. From 1973 until the COVID pandemic, the armed services hit their recruiting targets every year. And then COVID hit. As a result, in 2022, the Army missed its total recruiting target by just over 15,000 recruits. In 2023, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy missed their recruiting targets by a little over 23,000 recruits. In 2024, though, that completely turned around, and the armed forces exceeded their total recruiting targets in part due to changes that were made to improve recruiting efforts, and those efforts will also put them ahead of recruiting targets in 2025. The all-volunteer military has a 50-year history of success. Not only has it met our manpower needs, it has produced the finest fighting force the world has ever known. It is a force of people who want to serve, not a force of people forced to serve. Despite that record of success, the proponents of this proposition believe that in response to a 2-year transitory recruiting shortfall of less than 40,000 recruits, we should reinstate the draft and force millions of young Americans into involuntary military service at an astronomical cost, both in terms of dollars and social upheaval. And I would add, for the young women in this audience, that this mandatory service would likely include both men and women. Women have fought a decades-long fight to be treated equally in the military and ultimately won it in 2023 when they were allowed to serve in combat. There are now women who have passed Ranger School, who are SEALs, who are in special ops. There is no constitutionally legitimate basis to draft just men and not women. We believe the approach of the proponents is misguided, and to the extent there is still any issue at all with meeting manpower needs, there are better ways of addressing these challenges. In support of our position that we should not reinstate a draft in any form, I will present 2 expert witnesses on the historic failure of the draft to provide military personnel needs and alternative approaches to meeting those military personnel needs. Dr. Deborah Sheffer, Associate Dean, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Professor of History at Park University, is a leading authority on the history of the draft going back to the Revolutionary War. She will testify that historically a draft has been an ineffective means of providing military manpower and would do little, if anything, to address concerns about the readiness of recruits. Colonel Steve Leonard joined the University of Kansas School of Business as the director of the graduate program in Business and Organizational Leadership following a 28-year career in the U.S. Army. Colonel Leonard will testify that the selective service system is unprepared to meet the demands of a draft and lacks the reliability to meet the needs of the armed forces. He will also tell you that our recruiting methods need to and can evolve with technology and society to meet our manpower needs. And most importantly, he will tell you that reinstating the draft would degrade the quality of our armed forces and ultimately create a national security threat where one does not currently exist. Thank you for joining us this evening. We look forward to making our case.
Thank you, Mr. Duckers. We will now begin the affirmative case and hear from the affirmative's first witness. You may now present your case, counselor.
Call Professor Raymond, please. Good afternoon, sir. Would you please state your name and occupation?
Dr. William M. Raymond, Jr., Assistant Professor at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth.
Professor Raymond, my first question to you is, historically, has a military draft been a viable manpower policy for the United States?
The short answer is yes. The draft has been a viable military manpower policy for the United States for 35 years during our nation's history. 2 years during the Civil War from 1863 to 1865, 1 year during World War I, 1917 to 18, 5 years during World War II, 1940 to 1945, and then 27 years during the Cold War to include the Korean and Vietnam Wars, 1945 to 47, and then 1948 to 1973. During these 4 draft periods, a policy of relying solely on volunteers did not meet the nation's manpower needs, and a variety of advocates in the U.S. political system during each conflict helped ensure the passage of a draft. Only conscription was able to supply the necessary forces needed to defend our nation and defeat the threat at the time at our security. Each time a draft was enacted, 4 conditions were required. First, the existence of an external threat. Second, a perceived protracted conflict. Third, political advocates needed to promote a draft. And fourth, the American public had to support its enactment. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate sides tried to rely on volunteers initially. Ironically, it was in the South in April 1862, which passed the first American draft law. For the Union side, the Militia Act of 1862 followed shortly thereafter, which allowed President Abraham Lincoln to draft manpower from the states who didn't meet their quotas. This draft never went into effect since volunteer enlistment soared. In early 1863, however, heavy Union losses at Antietam and Fredericksburg prompted Congress by comfortable margins to pass the Enrollment Act of 1863. Lincoln nor his Secretary of War, Stanton, never commented publicly on the draft. This act, like the Confederate one, allowed for substitutions and commutations for $300. We all remember from our history classes the New York City draft riots in July of 1863, as they were the bloodiest civil riots in American history due to the act being perceived as promoting a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. For the Union, over 2.7 million men were inducted, but only 6% came from the draft. The major impact of the draft was to spur voluntary enlistments, and the key lesson learned was that future drafts need to be fair and equitable. Prior to the U.S. entry into World War I in early 1916, the Army Chief of Staff, General Hugh Scott, and the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, persuaded a reluctant President Woodrow Wilson to allow them to secretly start planning for the implementation of a draft. In April 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act by wide margins with overwhelming public support. Even former President Teddy Roosevelt advocated for its passage, stating, "The military tent, where all sleep side by side, will rank next to the public school among the greatest agents of democratization." Over 24 million men registered for the draft. The draft provided 67% of the manning for the war and spurred voluntary enlistments, more than 700,000 volunteers in 1917 alone. In 1918, the Supreme Court also upheld the constitutionality of the act in the Arver et al. Versus United States case. In 1940, while still at peace, a group of private citizens, part of the Military Training Camps Association, a well-connected and influential interest group, lobbied for and helped ensure the passage of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 by large congressional majorities. This interest group even wrote the actual legislation that would be introduced in each chamber of Congress. A Gallup poll in December 1940 showed that 89% of Americans thought the draft was a good idea. This peacetime draft prepared our nation to respond swiftly and decisively after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Nearly 50 million men registered and more than 19 million were inducted during World War II. Selective service supplied 2/3 of the manpower of the armed forces during the war. These draftees are part of the greatest generation. At the end of World War II, Congress extended selective service for 2 more years, given the turmoil of world events. However, from April 47 to June 48, the nation relied once again on volunteers. Unfortunately, the Army needed 30,000 volunteers a month, but only got 12,000. Due to the lack of volunteers to meet the nation's military manpower needs and emphasizing the communist menace, President Harry Truman called for the passage of the Selective Service Act of 1948 before an emergency joint session of Congress, which they did. Volunteering increased greatly once again, basically 8 to 10 volunteers for every conscript drafted. The debate for renewal came up during the Korean War and passed in 1951 by widespread margins, just as it did every time the act came up for renewal in 1955, 59, 63, and 67. In addition to the growing threat posed by the Soviet Union, supporters emphasized other benefits to American society from the draft, such as promoting good citizenship and greater social ties. In the early 1970s, only the growing unpopularity towards the Vietnam War and the unfairness of the draft prompted the change to the all-volunteer force in 1973. So in conclusion, yes, the draft has been a viable military manpower policy for the United States for 35 years during our history.
My next question, how would resuming a military draft benefits the United States and its citizens at this time?
There are 4 major reasons why the United States need to implement a draft now. First, the United States military does not have the manpower to fight large-scale combat operations, also known as LSCO. Today, the active duty stands at only 445,000 soldiers, 41,000 fewer than 3 years ago, and the smallest it's been since 1940. The current issue of Foreign Affairs has an article, The Return of Total War, Understanding and Preparing for a New Era of Comprehensive Conflict. The American military nor the American people are ready for the staggering combat losses that we last saw during World War II. In the current Russia-Ukraine war, they have a combined 1 million killed and wounded in action in just 2 years. U.S. Army doctrine posits 800 killed in 1 day of LSCO. That's 24,000 combat deaths in 1 month alone. The all-volunteer force isn't going to provide that for us. Our individual ready reserve, the IRR, is at an all-time low. The IRR consists of those who decided to leave the military but are still obligated to serve if recalled in the case of an emergency. In 1973, the IRR consisted of over 700,000 former military personnel. In 2022, it is now only 76,000. We no longer have a strategic military manpower bench to rely upon. Second reason, the United States military is becoming increasingly separated from the society it serves. Less than half of 1% of Americans serve in the military. The share of the U.S. population with military experience is at an all-time low at 7.3%. The U.S. military has become a family business. 80% of recent Army enlistees have a veteran in the family, and for 30% of them, it is one of their parents. I'm a proud father. My son's currently serving in Germany. He's had 3 combat deployments. Besides becoming politically and socially isolated from the society they serve, our military and their families pay a volunteer tax. The multiple deployments and time away from home and the rising levels of PTSD and suicides are all concentrated on that less than 1% who do serve. The third reason, given the political and social divisions within America today, we need something to bring together as Americans, which a draft would. I told you earlier about Roosevelt's quote about Americans sleeping together, side by side in an Army tent, and how that shared experience brings people together. Just hope people don't snore when they're sleeping in that tent with you, right? Let me give you a more recent example. Back in September 2004, I interviewed Representative Charlie Rangel in Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know this veteran, he represented New York City for 47 years in the House of Representatives. Almost every year, he introduced legislation calling for a draft. He firmly believed that if we are going to send our youth to war, the governing principle must be that of shared sacrifice. Everyone is doing something. He spoke fondly of his Army days. Most don't know he served as a fire direction specialist in the Korean War. And he stated that anyone who has ever served their nation, almost all brag about their experiences and sense of camaraderie. A primary result of his legislation would be to instill a love of country and a sense of obligation among young Americans today. He believed that the military needs of the Department of Defense would have to be met by more than just raising incentives. And the fourth reason we need a return to the draft is that our traditional recruiting incentives are no longer working. Our all-volunteer force is at a breaking point. We are paying more for a recruit and receiving a lower quality in return. The cost per recruit was slightly over $8,000 in 1994. In 2013, it was over $22,000. I have never liked calling our force all volunteer because what we really have is an all recruited force. We have all seen over the past 2 years how our military services, Army, Air Force, Navy, have not met their recruiting goals. And that's with us paying the highest signing bonuses ever, as high as $65,000 per recruit, which is the current statutory limit. What happens when we experience what happened to Army recruiters in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1973 when the all-volunteer force started? That year, the city had an unemployment rate of 7.2%, one of the highest in the state. The recruiters placed an ad in the local paper offering $1,500 enlistment bonus, but the paper misprinted the bonus, added an extra zero for $15,000. The worried recruiters did not have to tell any prospective volunteers about the mistake because no one showed up the next day asking about the bonus. If the military keeps offering higher and higher cash bonuses, but does not meet its current recruiting requirements like we are now, then what? The all-volunteer force is close to breaking now, and when it does break, wouldn't it be better that we have a draft in place so we can be prepared just like we were back in 1940? And all this effort to recruit this military volunteer, roughly 1/3 of them failed to complete their first term of enlistment. The General Accounting Office estimates that this high attrition rate of first-termers costs the military more than $1.3 billion each year. Contrast this with the 1/3 dropout rate, with only 1 in 10 draftees who did not complete their 2-year obligation during the Cold War. So in conclusion, we need a draft today because the all-recruited force is close to breaking, and the United States is not ready for large-scale combat operations in a total war. Our nation's ability to credibly signal its potential to endure and prevail in protracted conflict can serve as a powerful deterrent against potential adversaries. The United States needs a draft now so we can win not only the first battle with what we have, but also win the larger war with a force that we currently do not have. Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you, sir. You may step down.
No. Get back in your seat.
I beg your pardon. I forgot about you, Ed.
We have not yet begun to fight.
You better be ready.
So, Professor Raymond, I just want to stay with your last point there about the cost of recruiting.
Yes, sir.
And get some advice for myself as a law firm from you as to how I should handle this. You know, you're not going to believe this, but we have to pay almost $200,000 a year to recruit first-year lawyers out of law school, and we have to spend a lot of money to recruit them. We could save a lot of money if I could go on law school campuses and at the point of a gun, force young lawyers to come work for my law firm for $50,000 a year. Should I be able to do that?
Force your lawyers to serve?
Yeah, for less than a market rate.
Will they
at
be
the point of a
shot
gun?
Will they be shot at by
No,
somebody other than your gun? Like if they're fighting for their nation?
It doesn't matter. I'm asking you the
No,
question. Answer my question, Professor Raymond.
No.
Should I be able to force people to work for my law firm for less than a market rate simply because I want them to?
I think your economist, Milton Friedman, would argue that in a fair market capitalist economy, that shouldn't happen.
Absolutely.
Right.
And he would argue that free men should not be conscripted and drafted either, right?
However, freedom is not fear, and we all bear a burden to share that responsibility.
So let me talk about that for a second. You made much of the fact that the draft fulfilled our military personnel needs for 35 years out of our 250-year history, correct?
And how many of those years are actually wartime?
We're not in a war right now,
Right.
are we? No, we're not, are we?
Okay.
All right. The all-volunteer military has fulfilled our manpower needs for the last 50 years, correct?
Not necessarily. When I wrote my master's thesis under Colonel Benson back in 2004-5, the Army missed recruiting goals then, hence why I wrote my...
And then made them up in later years, correct,
Well,
Professor?
the Marines made their goal this year, but they cut 19,000 positions, lowered their quotas. So if you lower, the Army's the smallest it's ever been, so you recruit less. But we don't have enough manpower to fight in our non-war time now. When we go to war and we lose 24,000 people in 1 month, where are those men coming from?
Well, let me ask you this. We're not at war now, correct? You're advocating for a peacetime draft, correct?
Just like in 1940.
And so what I want to understand when you talk about the draft, because there's a lot of different ways you could do it, I want to know what you're talking about. So there are different models, for example. Let's take one, for example, what I will call the Israeli and South Korean model, which is mandatory military service, no exceptions, no deferments, unless you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew in Israel.
Israel's changed that.
For
They have to serve now.
For every man and woman of a certain age. Is that what you're talking about as a draft? We're going to require every 19 and 20-year-old in this room and around the country to serve for 2 years in the military? Is that what you have in mind?
Well, my dear colleague will cover this during his remarks.
Well, you're advocating for a draft. I want to know what you're advocating for.
Well, in
Is that what you want? Mandatory conscription for everyone? Or are you talking about something arbitrary and laden with exemptions like the Vietnam draft?
Well, the Vietnam draft in 1967 passed by overwhelming margins.
That's not my question, Professor Raymond. I'm asking you what you're talking about when you say we need a draft today.
In America, we believe in freedom of choice, right? Everybody should have an obligation to serve their country. Why did President Kennedy create the Peace Corps? Why do we have VISTA? Why do we have national service programs? Everybody should serve, and if you don't want to serve in the military, you can serve in Homeland Security. You can teach for America. So you have a choice where you want to serve to get the benefits that you get.
Okay, so what you're talking about is mandatory service for everyone in the country. You're not excluding women, are you?
Women are, first in 2013, women were cleared for combat.
Right.
Most
So-
women groups favor being, and they, like you mentioned, they are equal to men and in many ways perform better than men. Why would we, and then with cyber warfare and everything else, and women I think are personally smarter, just ask my wife, right? So why would we exclude more than 50% of the population
Completely agree.
from
I'm not,
serving?
not
So
arguing
oh,
with
you
you
agree
about
with
that.
me.
I
Okay.
completely agree with you.
Thank you.
That if you have, so you're talking about taking every man and woman in the country of a certain age, let's say 20 years, from 19 to 20, and they do 2 years of service either in the military or in some sort of made-up jobs program or whatever. And my question to you is, what would that cost? What are you going to pay each of these people, and where are you going to come up with that money?
Well, two comments. 72% of American youth from 18 to the age of 24 aren't qualified to serve in our military.
That's not my question.
No, well, it's not millions of people that can serve. 72% of our nation's youth, obesity, mental problems, misconduct, police, they are not eligible to serve.
Don't forget
we're
bone spurs.
We're talking a very small part. You know, I bet we can take the $1.3 billion we save from those volunteers that don't complete their initial terms. We can use that to help pay for the draft.
Well, now I'm really confused, Professor Raymond. So if I'm part of the 72% who's obese or has diabetes or has bone spurs or just simply has a doctor that can identify me as being physically defective, I don't have to serve at all?
Well, Dr. Benson will talk about...
Well, no, that's my question. If I'm not physically capable in the military, of serving in the military, does that excuse me from any of this alternative service you're
Well, we
talking
can go back
about?
to the Civil War and I'll just write
That's
you
not my
a check
question.
for $300 and I can get out of serving. A draft has to be fair and equitable. And my colleague will talk about, his question is, how can the United States do it? And then he will bring in examples of different countries that have done it successfully. And, you know, here's a case in point. You know, I'm currently sponsoring the Swiss officer. Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland's got the Alps protecting it. It doesn't really need a security force, right? But 90% of the country supports their draft. You know why? They have 26 cantons. They have 4 different languages. How do you bring national unity together? they use a draft. Why can't we be like Switzerland where everybody
Are
can
you
serve?
seriously contending, Professor Rabin, that instituting a draft, based on our experience coming out of Vietnam and the divisiveness of that, and the fact that people who serve now do so because they choose, because it's a great alternative, and what you're going to do is force them at the point of a gun to serve, you think that's going to promote national unity? Is that your position?
You know, I did a survey back in 2004, and if I asked anybody, when you think of the draft, what do you think of? And they think, I mean, I was in a riot with Jane Fonda when I was a little kid in Monterey, California. I know what protests look like. 1967, the American people and Congress reapproved the draft for 4 years. As it became unfair, which we will totally agree with you on, when it becomes unfair, Americans don't like that. So when it becomes unfair, we then protest that. Is she right or are you right? So the draft has been very successful. The draftees, we talk so highly of the greatest generation, those were draftees. They're not bums that are any less capable or brave than the all recruited force that we have today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, I left some time for you.
Dr. Benson?
I'm tempted to say, Counselor, that after my colleagues' comments, it seems that my work here is done, but I'm ready.
It's not.
Okay.
We ready to start time? All right. Dr. Benson, my first question to you, sir, is what would a fair and equitable draft be like in today's world?
Well, as Bill pointed out in his overview, as the counsel for the opposing side has also pointed out, the issue of our draft, there were perceived and quite real inequities over who was called and who ended up serving. It was mentioned a rich man's fight. Am I already over time? Oh my God. Oh, yeah, I'm done. And so
let's do this. Let's stop just a moment. Can we start over, please, with time? It's okay, sir. Take your time. Take your time. It's okay.
Oh, I really thought that was the timer.
Remember when that happened to Kathleen Sebelius in the White House? It happens to the best of us. Okay, let's start over.
So as I was saying that...
Let me start
all right,
from the
well,
beginning.
Very well.
Professor Benson, what would a fair and equitable draft look like today?
Well, I have outlined an outline of a proposal that I fully admit would need to be debated, discussed, thoroughly vetted, but I offer this as a start point. Yes, I believe that what we should do is a combination of conscription and selective service. So by that I mean that upon reaching the age of 18, all young men and women would register. That there would be 2 call-up periods, arbitrary, just a thought, January and July, and that all men and women would be medically, psychologically, and physically evaluated. And based upon military needs to sustain the force, and this is the entire armed forces, all medically, psychologically, and physically capable would enter basic training. Basic training. But only selected people would go to advanced training. And this would develop then in our country a depth of minimally trained people who could be called upon when needed, that pool of people to back up the all-recruited force. In case of emergency, we don't have to cast around. We know there are people who've already been evaluated. Those who are not selected for advanced training revert to a ready reserve status until age 40. Those who go on would serve for 2 or 3 years. Again, that could be refined in the process of doing this as a bill through our legislature. For most people, registration and basic training would fulfill the obligation of national service and being a citizen. That's what I would say as a start point for the discussion. As my colleague was saying, you can find any number of articles that talk about, based on what we see in Ukraine primarily, and the incredible casualties. Our military hasn't faced those kind of fights. I remember when Somalia happened, and oh my goodness, there was a platoon of Rangers, 40, that had to fight their way out of a rather enormous fight. But that was a very small number, no less vicious, no less brutal, no less heroic. I do not gainsay that. But we haven't had the fight of, like, Bastogne in World War II. We haven't had a Saipan or a Tinian or an Okinawa where we were fighting an enemy that had a full range of means. As a friend of mine wrote in an article, when a carrier is hit by an intercontinental ballistic missile, in that instant, we lose 5,000 sailors. Not counting the fact that the industrial base might not be able to build another carrier. That's 5,000 sailors, and the Navy doesn't have the depth, no pun intended there, to rebuild the crew needed. Having a combination of conscription and selective service gives, it's like an insurance policy of having folks we know have been evaluated and can serve if needed. But that is the essence of my proposal, Counselor.
Dr. Benson, what other countries are using a military draft or have switched to the draft? And how is the draft in those countries accepted by the general population?
In the research that I did, there are 178 nations on our planet who have some form of mandatory service, a draft, national service, things like that, from Russia to Taiwan. The opposing counselor brought up Israel, so I will look at Israel as well, but just 3 countries, Israel, Norway, and Sweden, just for an instance. The Israelis, that's universal service. That is a part of being an Israeli citizen, is serving. It's widely accepted, that's what they do. Have there been hiccups in their system? Yes. When the over 1.1 million Russian Jews were incorporated into Israel, the Russian Jews brought their culture with them, which was doing everything they could to avoid service because they were thinking of serving in the Russian army. That took some years to overcome, to embrace them, to assimilate those people into Israeli society. As Bill pointed out, the Knesset recently passed a law, and it remains to be seen how that will work, where the Orthodox, who had been excluded for very wonderful, valid religious reasons, are now required to serve because of the growing population of Orthodox Jews in Israel. But Israel works. The Norwegians and the Swedes had both stopped conscription near the end of what we called the Cold War, and they've recently started it again. The Norwegians have a law that requires all young people, and since 2015, including women, to serve for 12 months in the armed forces. In reality, not all do, but it becomes almost competitive, according to the research I did, of folks who want to serve and will serve underneath their combination of conscription and selective service. They go through much the same thing. They're evaluated, they test out, and then those who pass all the tests can serve. All the others have met their legal obligation of citizenship. The Swedes have much the same. They call it a total defense, where they've incorporated also cyber skills, military, actual combat-oriented military skills or logistic. But again, it's everyone registers, men and women. They're all tested. And because of the needs of their service, not everyone has to serve, but everyone must register, must be evaluated, and go through some form of training. The populations of those countries accept that as an obligation of citizenship. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. Thank you very much.
Do you have any further comment, Dr. Benson?
In the research that I did, it appeared to me that especially in the Western nations, in view of their observations of what is happening in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians are having a tough time because they limit their conscription to only people who are 25 and older, and not their youth, that they're having a hard time restoring their losses. We are not at war. Although my friends in the 2,500 American soldiers who are still serving in Iraq and the 800 American soldiers who are still serving in Syria might cast some doubt on the statement that we're not at war, not to mention the sailors in the Red Sea. The depth of a tested reserve pool of qualified people add to the deterrent effect that our nation's military would have available. Counselor.
One final question, Dr. Benson. Would it be fair to say that adopting the draft is in our nation's best interest for its safety, its security, and welfare?
And I believe so. Not because I want people to serve at the point of a gun, but I really would like to be able to know that there are folks, because I'm an old man and I'm beyond being able to serve again, are ready if called upon. And the fact that the enemy gets a vote. We don't know when war is going to come. And we might not be interested in war, but war might be interested in us. And being ready is part of deterring.
Thank you, Dr. Benson.
Good evening, Counselor.
Colonel Benson, how
Sir.
are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you.
I want to make sure our audience understands something that you talked about that's
Okay.
probably not clear, and that's the difference between the selective service and the draft.
Aha.
So the selective service is the mechanism by which young men and women register or are registered so that we would know they're eligible and available for military service
Excuse me.
in the event of a crisis, correct?
Sir.
And the selective service model that we have, no, it's no longer even functioning, correct? It's supposed to be registering people, but it hasn't for 20 years.
That is my understanding, yes.
Right. So that's something that we need to fix.
Agreed. That's
Yeah.
why I proposed that.
But you don't have to draft people next.
Well, it is.
Correct? I just want to make the distinction.
Well, it is
So-
a draft, Counselor.
Well, it's registration. It identifies people. And then the draft is a second different step where you decide to send a letter to those people you identified, which is the point of the gun, saying you need to report for basic training on this date, correct?
Well, that's why what I proposed as a start point for a debate that would refine this, it's not our current selective service. It is more akin with the research that I did on what the Norwegians and the Swedes are doing, which is a combination of conscription, draft, where everyone must register, everyone must present him or herself for service, go through some training, and then upon completion of that, based on needs, then that is the selective part.
Yeah. Now, in my research, it said that there isn't an Israeli-type model in Norway or Serbia.
No, that's correct. There
You
isn't.
have to register, but they are not drafting all of the eligible people. There is no draft of all the eligible young men and women to serve in the military in Norway or Sweden, correct?
There is a legal requirement, again, as I understand, where they must come forth and register, and it is required to have military training. At the point of my research right now was, it appears that not everyone does, but the society accepts that this is a requirement.
Okay. Let me ask you this, because if I understand your starting point, we're going to improve the selective service, and then we're actually going to draft everybody.
Yes.
At what age?
Well, I have proposed at age 18 that people will come forward and register for service.
And then within 6 months of that, they're going to be called in.
Again, my proposal was, as I said, 2 call-up times a year, and that's just arbitrary from late at night scratching on paper.
Okay.
But January and July.
How many 18-year-olds are we talking about every year? 4, 5, 6, 7 million? 10 million?
I don't really.
We're including men and women.
Let's say, yeah, that would
10
be.
million?
Sure.
What are we going to pay them when they come in for their training?
And again, I would offer that is, that's why I said this is a proposal. This is something that I would hope and advocate that our Congress would take up, because it has to be supported, as we pointed out, by not only people but the representatives of the people. And what better way in a democracy to determine that than to have the open debate and the input from a range of people?
Well, an economist would tell you the better way in a democracy is to have the military compete with other employment opportunities and attract those people to serve in the military who find that to be the most advantageous career path to choose, which is what the volunteer military has done successfully for the last 50 years, correct?
Well, and again, I agree with my colleague that we make ourselves feel good by saying, thank you for your service. You volunteered. No, those young men and women were recruited.
No argument there.
They were induced, the economic inducements.
They were presented alternatives
Right.
for their career, and they looked at the military and said, you know what, for me, that's my best path.
Perhaps
yes.
Yes.
I can get paid at least as much as I can get paid anyplace else. I can get important training that I can parlay into a career down the road. Maybe I want to stay in the military. That's a great career. I get the modified GI Bill now, so I can afford to go to college where I couldn't be before. It's a very attractive compensation package for some people, not all people.
Much like my father did when he was drafted in World War II.
Right. When an Army, not recruiter, but enlisting officer shows up with a gun and says, you have to show up, go to basic training, or you're going to jail.
Well, Counselor, forgive me, you're engaging in hyperbole, because that
Of course I'm
doesn't happen.
engaging in hyperbole. That's
Oh,
what
okay.
I'm paid to do.
Oh, great, okay. I just want to make sure I understood.
But it is at the point of a gun, because you go, if you don't show up for the draft, or you dodge the draft or whatever, that's subject to criminal penalties, correct? And
As in accord with the laws that were passed by the representatives of the people, sure.
Right, and a
Which
law
is-
enforcement officer carrying a gun will show up and slap handcuffs on you and take you to jail if you don't respond to the military's call that you served involuntarily. Isn't that a fact?
I don't really know it's a fact. I've never really known that happened. Is it a possibility? Is it one of those negative inducements? Perhaps so. But like we've pointed out in the history, that the possibility of a draft will also increase volunteerism. The point, though, of the draft, as we've been trying to make the case, is that given the world today, given what we are seeing, that successful deterrence requires a depth of, I thank you, a depth of people that we know can serve and can be brought in.
And there are other ways to deal with that, aren't there? You could improve the selective service, so you have your bench identified in case manpower needs are necessary.
Which is the same thing that we're talking about.
No, you're talking about bringing them in for testing and then putting them through basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, 70% of those people, if I understand the math right, or what history tells, 70% of the people you bring in for physical and mental evaluation are going to fail, correct?
Oh, that's what I heard.
Yeah, and then what do you do with them? They just get to go home? Because I was thinking about it, I think I'm probably smart enough to pass the mental exam, but if I'm smart enough to pass it, I'm smart enough to fail it too.
Sure.
So how are you going to deal with that?
Well, in those cases, you don't have a failure rate unless you come in. I'm keeping an eye on it.
I know, but the 70% who fail, what do they do? Are they just excused? Like, I got
No.
bone spurs, I failed the mental test.
But
What
they've-
is it? You just go
they've
home
been-
and you
they've
dodge
been-
the draft?
They've been assessed. There's a record, and they can still be called depending upon the level of the emergency of the nation. We know that happened, that the draft, when we needed more folks, we called them. I know that happened in World War II. Because my dad was 17 when he got called, so.
Mine was too.
Okay.
All right, I
Thank
think
you,
I'm out of
miss.
time. Am I out of time?
Thank you,
I
Counselor.
have 6 seconds and I can't think of anything else to bother you with.
All right. Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you, Mr. Benson.
Pardon?
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
You can step down.
Thank you, Dr. Benson.
My privilege.
I yield the floor to my honorable opponent, Mr. Ed Ducker.
Thank you, Mr. Irigonegaray. Our first witness is Dr. Deborah Sheffer. If you would please take the stand. Good evening, Dr. Sheffer. Thank you for being here. Could you please briefly describe for the audience your educational and professional background?
I got my PhD in military history from the University of Kansas. I was a West Point summer seminar fellow in military history, and my research has been involved with Black American service and somewhat related to the draft in those ways. So for this, I just basically expanded on some of the research I had already started for my other projects.
Okay. And could you tell the audience what your current employment and position is?
I'm a history professor at Park University as well as an associate dean of class at Park University.
Okay. And what is it about these experiences that in your view qualifies you to opine on the question of whether or not the draft should be reinstated?
I've looked at the way people have served and how they've been brought into service, and some how they've wanted to serve but been denied. So I've looked at it from several aspects, not quite this one until this project came up.
All right. Do you believe the draft should be reinstated?
I do not.
All right. You've heard some of the issues raised by the other side. Do you believe a draft would actually address any of the concerns that they've raised?
Marginally, at best.
Okay, and why is that?
Military manpower shortages are probably as old as war, and the U.S. has experienced military manpower shortages in all or nearly all of its wars. So it's nothing new, and we have relied heavily on the draft in most of those shortage times. So the historical record of the draft is its own worst witness because it shows that it's inefficient, costly, very unpopular, and it doesn't always provide the manpower that it was established to provide.
And can you expand on, historically, in different periods of time, the limited periods of time in our nation's history when we've actually had a draft and conscripted men? Can you expand on the manpower shortages that still resulted as a result of, even with a draft?
Right. Well, to almost quote my opponent, ironically, the Confederacy resorted to the draft first in 1862, and the records for the Confederacy are incomplete and sparse, so the 1863 Union draft is a better place to start. And war enthusiasm was high, very high at the beginning of the war. Men and boys were falling all over themselves to try and enlist. In fact, Lincoln had to turn away tens of thousands of volunteers because he could only accept 75,000. There were a variety of reasons why they were trying to enlist. For one, it was going to be a really short and fun war, so it was going to be an adventure. No one was really going to die. Someone said he could mop up all the blood with a handkerchief or put it in a thimble. So it was going to be a fun time and everyone would be home soon. There was also the manhood issue, the honor issue, and the cause issue, the cause of union. They were fighting for the union. So initial war enthusiasm did not last. By mid-1862, for a variety of reasons, enlistment volunteerism plummeted, war enthusiasm plummeted. For one thing, the war was dragging on way too long. Casualty lists were way too long. Battlefield photographs were way too gruesome and scary. And about late 1862, when Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, people said, I think he's going to implement a draft, and I think he's going to expand war aims to include emancipation, something that not everyone was in favor of. So all of these things led to not enough manpower shortages.
Could I just stop you there
Yes,
for 1
please.
second, and then I want to get back to this. But you mentioned that Lincoln could only handle, was it 75,000
Yes.
troops that were volunteering? So I'm still have no idea exactly what the other side's talking about in terms of a draft. But let's say we're talking about 2 or 3 million young men and women every year that would be at peacetime involuntarily conscripted today. Do we have the facilities in this country to even handle that? I mean, is that even remotely doable?
I do not believe we do, and what old facilities we do have would need a lot of updating or maybe even rebuilding or starting from scratch to enable that.
You have to house people, you have to train people, you
Yes.
have to feed people, you
Yes.
got to pay them something. And in your view, in your opinion, we don't have those capabilities.
We don't. And, you know, when the Buffalo Soldiers went west, they had to build their own barracks as they went. So we might be in that kind of situation again.
I mean, other than it being a Bob Marley song, could you tell me what the Buffalo Soldiers were?
Yes. Black Americans served so well in the Civil War that after the war, Congress created the first 6 all-black units, military units. They later reduced it to 4. But this was a big, big deal because it was the first peacetime service for Black Americans, and they had been striving for service for many, many decades. And peacetime service was especially precious to them because it was a pathway to citizenship and equal rights. So they were sent out west or to the south to be occupation forces. And those who went out west were sent there to not only build infrastructure, but to subjugate the American Indian. They didn't really relish that job, but they did it very, very well. And they ended up with the name Buffalo Soldiers, and there are several possible reasons for that, but they were called Buffalo Soldiers, and it became a point of pride for them because it was a prideful name. So that's who the Buffalo Soldiers are.
Okay. Let's, because we're going to get jammed on time, shift from the history of the draft to current concerns about potential recruit readiness.
Yes.
Whether, you know, the sorts of people we have available are ready enough. Would a draft, in your opinions, solve that problem or address that concern?
I do not believe it would.
Can you tell the audience why you don't believe it would address that concern?
A draft would capture that 72% who would not be able to pass the tests. So they would go home, and the ones who could pass the tests would be drafted. And we've dealt with recruit readiness. It's nothing new. It's old. We've dealt with it before. I mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers. Before they were called the Buffalo Soldiers, when they were first put into these units, illiteracy was very, very high. And so the Army put extra chaplains with each unit to address the literacy problems, and it worked. So we raised people up to meet the standards so that they could serve. World War I testing showed that the average native-born American had a mental age of 13. In 1962, a third of all 18-year-olds evaluated for the draft were rejected, and half of those for mental aptitude. In 1980, half of all recruits were rejected and placed into Category 4, which is they're not making the minimum standards. So we've seen these things before, and like the Civil War and the Buffalo Soldiers, we've addressed it in different ways. For example, in 1943, during World War II, literacy testing revealed that resulted in high numbers of white Southerners being drafted and high numbers of Black Americans being dismissed because they couldn't pass the literacy test. So they dropped the literacy test. So in some cases, we raise people up, and in some cases, we lower the standards. And the Army right now is raising people up, successfully so.
Through the volunteer force.
Through the volunteer pre-preparation program.
Let me ask you a question just to diverge here from a second, because we've heard the argument made that somehow having a draft that in some fantasy world would include everybody would be more equitable in terms of bringing people from different segments of society into the military. How'd that work out in Vietnam? Because my recollection is that the people drafted in Vietnam and those who served, especially in country, were disproportionately poor, disproportionately poorly educated, and disproportionately minorities. Is that correct?
Yes, they were. And I can name another draft where those numbers figure the same. The first draft in the Union called up 300,000. And here's how it broke down. 52,000 immediately just paid $300 and went home. 26,000 hired substitutes, and at that time, substitutes were a little prone to deserting or being serial bounty jumpers. Well over half of 300,000 received deferments. So in the end, when it all shook out, 9,881 men out of 300,000 put on a uniform.
So let me ask you this. I mean, I understand, I get the fact that military recruitment is going to be more appealing perhaps to people of lesser means, lesser opportunities, lesser educations than those of greater means. But would you agree with me that the voluntary military as we have it today is more representative of society as a whole than any draft has ever been?
I do, and we've seen several examples here. The 1943 literacy test was gaining disparate groups and being discriminatory. So we've seen this before. In lots of drafts, it turns out this way because the rich pay the fee or find a way to go or get bone spurs, and other people don't have the means to do this.
Now, bone spurs doesn't completely exempt you from military service. It just limits you to serving as commander-in-chief, correct?
That's probably true.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sheffer.
What were you saying? Congress allowed.
Cross-examination?
Yes. First of all, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We obviously differ in opinion. You have raised valid criticisms of the way the draft was implemented during the Civil War, correct?
Yes.
The idea that someone could pay $300 and not serve and get someone else to serve certainly shows inequity, correct?
Yes.
During the Vietnam War, not only bone spurs, but there were also individuals that were able to avoid the draft for a variety of other reasons, correct?
Yes.
So to make sure I understand, you're not arguing against the draft, you're arguing about an unfair, unequitable, an inappropriate draft, correct?
Not quite.
Well, you have not said a word other than criticizing historically the way the draft was implemented. In your mind, can you envision for our nation's safety, the security of our Constitution, the security of our people, and the welfare of our future for our children and grandchildren, can you conceive of a draft that would be fair and equitable in order to provide us the protection that our military is prepared to do?
In very extreme conditions, but only under extreme conditions.
Let's talk about those extreme conditions. What extreme conditions are you referring to?
Existential threat?
Well, I'm not talking about a war situation or an existential threat. I'm talking about implementing a draft now, before we have, as counselor using super hyperbole, has on numerous occasions talked about a recruiter aiming a gun at our children's head to get them to be soldiers. Let's not talk in those terms. Let's talk realistically about the defense of our nation. Let's talk realistically about what we need to do in order to ensure that the United States of America is prepared to meet its military needs. As you sit there today, without an existential threat, which some would argue exists right now with the current administration approach to Russia, to North Korea, etc. Can you imagine a draft system that would be equitable and fair? Is that something that you believe is achievable? Yes or no?
No.
So under no circumstances can you conceive of a draft that would be fair and equitable. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And your reasons for that?
Because a draft would catch the 72% who would not meet the standards.
Well, but how is that unworkable? If that percentage is not available to serve for legitimate reasons, then isn't it fair and equitable to exclude those individuals?
But then we have the
Yes or no?
disparities.
Is it fair and equitable to exclude those that cannot serve?
No,
It's not fair?
no.
So you would, in your mind, if an existential threat occurred, force those individuals that are incapable of serving to serve? Is that what you're saying? Yes or no?
No.
Well, then I'm not following you. If you're saying that you wouldn't force those individuals to serve in an existential threat that couldn't serve because they're part of that 74%, and then you're saying that excluding the 74% from the draft makes it unworkable, how does that add up?
Because, let me gather my thoughts for a second.
Well, I wish you would, because those two are not compatible.
The threat would have to be so great,
But we're not talking about a threat.
then it
We're-
wouldn't work.
Okay. Assuming for a second that we accept that, the 74%, what other reasons do you have to suggest that an intelligent, well-crafted draft would not work?
Because in every draft, even ones for so-called popular wars, there have been resistors and evaders and people who flee,
Let me interrupt you a second. Assuming for a moment that we had a volunteer, or as my witnesses have said, a recruited army, wouldn't those same people do the same thing in a recruited or volunteer army?
I don't believe so.
So you think that the same people that would avoid military service by draft would voluntarily join?
That's not the same thing.
Well, no, that's exactly what you said.
I think that volunteers would volunteer.
All right? So we have the pool of volunteers. All right? They're going to, if a draft is implemented, they're going to also join happily in that draft, correct?
Perhaps.
Well, wait a minute. Isn't volunteerism as a consequence of wanting to help the nation?
Yes, but in World War I and World War II, they discouraged volunteerism because they wanted more draftees so that they could channel people. They would take this person and say, oh, you should go to the battlefield, and this person should go to the factory. So they discouraged or even did not allow volunteering so that they could draft people and evaluate them and place them.
Are you aware of what the recruiting bonus was in this year's recruited military?
I am not.
You think that that would be an important consideration for you to have?
I think benefits would always be important, such as updated housing.
No, I'm not talking about benefits. I'm talking about the recruitment amount that's being paid to those individuals that join the Army. Do you think that that would be an important component of your opinions?
Yes.
And
because
you don't have that figure?
It's a benefit.
Well, it's an incentive to join, right?
Hmm.
And you don't know what that amount is.
I do not.
Do you know what that amount was in 1973?
I do not.
Are you aware that if we take the 1973 amount for recruitment purposes and brought it up to today's level, economic level, it would be over $100,000 per recruit?
Interesting. I did not know.
No further questions.
Thank you. I'd like to call Colonel Stephen Leonard to the stand. All right, Colonel Leonard, thank you for being with us this evening. Can you briefly describe for the audience your educational and professional background, including your current employment?
So currently, I am the Deputy Department Chair for Leadership and Entrepreneurship at the University of Kansas School of Business. Prior to that, 28-year career in the military, retired in 2014, came here, do not have a doctorate, so I am one of the less informed people in the audience today. But I do have 2 master's degrees and a good education behind me.
All right. And what is it about your background that qualifies you to opine on the subject of whether the draft should be reinstated?
Like my 2 esteemed colleagues, you know, a career in uniform, seeing things that work, seeing things that didn't work, and this is a subject that I have written and spoken on at length over the past several years.
Okay. In your opinion, should the draft be reinstated?
No.
Why is that? If you could give us an overview of your reasons as to why you would not reinstate the draft.
So there's 3 main points that I look at when it comes to the decision of whether or not we reinstate the draft. The first of which is I don't think we've completely exhausted our means of recruiting. And I think we've all talked about this today, the fact that recruiting did lag post-pandemic, and recruiting has lagged in the past. For people who have served, we all understand that the recruiters don't always keep up with the trends. They're not always adept with technology, and they're maybe a little slower to adapt. And so what we've seen post-pandemic is a complete revitalization of the commands that are responsible for recruiting across the services. What Dr. Raymond said is absolutely right. We have lowered goals, and so those goals are you can say they're easier to achieve, but we haven't just achieved those goals, we've exceeded those goals with great success. And part of that is changing our methods. What Deborah mentioned about using pre-basic training, prep tools, working to maybe get at that percentage of the population that isn't normally fit for military service physically, and giving them an opportunity by raising the floor and allowing them to serve, that solved part of the problem. And another big change has been the use of data analytics. And this is something that we haven't done in the past successfully, but we not only brought in fresh minds and new ideas, we worked with the military academies, math department, to develop algorithms and a process for doing this, and then brought in some of the best minds in uniform that work in data analytics and put them to work. And what they've been able to do is use data and data-informed methods to actually transform how recruiting works, while at the same time these recruiting commands have adapted their practices. There was just a story just recently that we're going to stop having recruiters focus on paperwork. We're going to find other people to do the paperwork so they can actually focus on what they're supposed to do, which is engage that population. At the same time, what you've seen is a change in the narrative, which is really interesting. We all came up in the world of be all you can be. Well, except for you. I think you came up in the Johnson administration, but that's all right. But we remember be all you can be and the message that it meant. And as somebody who spends his days with Gen Z, this is a population that is very receptive of that kind of a message. And it's really interesting to watch how that message resonates. And so this is something that the marketing and the recruiting people have seized on, that you give this generation that aspirational message that, hey, we're going to give you an opportunity to serve, and we're going to do it in a way that benefits you and that you grow and you become part of something bigger. That means something to people, and that is starting to translate into better numbers. And that's one reason. I think we need to see that through. Probably the other piece is one that, and I think we conflate these two, is it's important that we differentiate selective service from the draft. And selective service is that model that we use. It's a manpower model, where the draft is a mass conscription model. You can't have one without the other. And selective service is that model that you use to register those people, regardless of their readiness, that every male who's 18 years old has to sign up for the draft. We stopped enforcing selective service in 1988. And I think you mentioned that. Most people aren't even aware. I had coffee today with a college sophomore who admitted, looking at me, I didn't register for the draft, I forgot. But nobody came to knock on his door. That means that if you take that over the next 26 years, 36 years, what you're looking at is a database that is fundamentally flawed. Not only are people not registered who should be registered, selective service also has a requirement that for everybody between the ages of 18 and 26, you're required to notify the selective service every time you move, which nobody does. I didn't do it, you didn't do it, you didn't do it, we didn't know. You just sign up and you forget about it, right? Which means selective service isn't going to find you. So you have that flawed database to draw from. And then let's not forget how much society has changed. We talked about women in the military. We've come a long ways. We've come a long ways in the last decade. But women aren't required to register for the draft. They're not required to sign up for selective service. And oh, by the way, let's look at the next prospective Secretary of Defense, and let's say, do you think he wants to have women in the military? He's already made public comments to the contrary, which gives you a mountain to climb if you want to reform selective service, assuming that you have a Congress that will actually reform selective service. Before you can have a draft, you have to fix selective service. Will Congress fix it?
Let me follow up on that to make sure that I understand and the audience understands. Because the selective service system is flawed, hasn't been enforced for 30 years, doesn't include women, doesn't keep track of people who did registered and have moved, you couldn't implement a draft now because you can't find the people to draft because the selective service database is flawed.
Correct, assuming they registered in the first place.
Assuming they registered in the first place. So in order to even start talking about having a draft, in your opinion, you would have to completely redo the selective service database. And from what age ranges? Are we like going from 18 to 30 or 35 or 40? Does everyone have to go down and register with the selective service in order to actually have a draft?
You register at 18, and the database is supposedly maintained between 18 and 26.
But we've got people, between ages 18 and 45 who aren't registered in the selective service database. How are we going to fix that problem and have this fair and equitable draft that the other side fantasizes about?
That's the million-dollar question. And it really is the million-dollar question, because when you have a fundamentally flawed system that you have to draw those potential draftees from, you don't even get to what Deborah mentioned about an inequitable draft. You never get there because you have bad data to draw from in the first place. Assuming you can get those people, the only way to have a draft, to implement a draft, is to send the Selective Service Act back to Congress to fix.
So let me, because we've just got about 4 minutes left, and I really want to spend some time on this topic. Even if you could fix the Selective Service system and bring back a draft, first of all, do we need 2, 3, 4 million, 5, 6 million new people every year added to the armed forces? Do we need them in a peacetime military?
At this point, no.
In the event of a war, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, some existential threat, then you have to be able to call people up through a selective service.
Right, and what Deborah said, the existential threat is the silver bullet. When you have an existential threat, the draft really starts to make sense. Because when national security is truly threatened on that scale, yeah, you need the people.
Right.
And you've got to be able to find that pool of people because, frankly, the survival of the nation depends on that. And so it made sense in World War I. It made sense in World War II. At the height of the Cold War, it made absolute sense to do that. Johnson overextended the consensus that you normally have when you implement a draft, which led to the unrest in the late 60s. The lottery system made it worse. But prior to that, you had consensus.
So, Colonel Leonard, let me ask you this, because we're not talking about an existential threat or a wartime draft now. We're talking about a peacetime draft. And what impact would that have on the quality of our military services?
And that's a good question for debate, because historically, outside of the examples that our opponents mentioned, and specifically Israel and South Korea are great examples of conscripted forces where the quality of the force is maintained and it's superlative, but they exist in a constant, perpetual state of some form of national security threat that could be considered existential. In the absence of that, quality doesn't normally exist, and you start to have discipline problems. You have people who don't look at the potential for future service, but the potential to get out and do something else. You don't really develop that deep bench of skill sets that you hope you have because you don't have the people long enough to do that. So quality actually is reduced, and that's something I think that was pointed out during the Gates Commission, that you do have a reduction in quality over time. And if you have a lot of people who aren't quality, then you actually exacerbate the threat to your national security. Because what you do is, it's not a deterrent when you have an inept force. It is the opposite of that. It emboldens your opponents, and that puts you in a situation where you've actually, rather than decreased the threat by raising the size of the military, you have increased your threat
by degrading the quality of the military. And in your experience, bringing people who want to be there and don't want to be there together, all these different walks of life, do you get a kumbaya moment where everybody's happy and wants to be there and there's no desertion or disciplinary problems? Or do you have problems with the people who are being forced to be there that don't want to be there?
Yeah, it's an ongoing discipline issue because you deal with that mix of population. And we've actually seen some of that in our lifetimes. I mean, you and I are both Gulf War veterans. I served with an organization that came out of the New York National Guard who decided on the eve of war they weren't going to go to war. They voted not to go to war. And it was the most surreal thing I've ever seen in my life. But we're not going to cross the border. We refused to go into Iraq. And we were dealt with a situation of having to relieve leadership on the spot, find new leadership, figure out what to do. You don't see that. But those were people who didn't want to be there who were activated and forced to go.
And just to follow that up, you were in the military for 28 years. You're a colonel. You've commanded troops in the field. Yeah. The question for you is, would you rather command a force of troops who volunteered to be there or a force of troops who were forced to be there against their will?
Oh, that's not even a question. You want people who want to be there, obviously.
Thank you, Colonel Leonard.
Don't make me cry.
Oh, I won't, but I can assure you most of his questions are not really questions.
Okay.
You mentioned a number of statistical analyses using the latest technology to develop a recruited military, correct?
Yes.
And it's your position that a draft would not be feasible today, correct?
Not under the current selective service system, no.
Okay. So the issue for you is not whether or not it is in our nation's safety and best interest to have a well-prepared group of citizens who are drafted, but rather the fact that the system available in order to do so is broken.
The system as it exists today would not produce what you said.
As it exists today. But with all of the technology that you mentioned is available to you, with all the technology that we have available today to rectify those type of problems, do you envision the possibility that America could institute a draft based on the repair of those problems?
If you can assume that you could repair that system, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that if that system could be repaired, it is in our nation's security interest to have that type of force ready and available?
No, because we already have that kind of force ready and available.
What percentage of the American population is serving right now in the military?
I think you said what?
No, I'm asking, no, listen.
It's less than 1%.
It's less than 1%,
Less than 1%.
correct?
Yep.
You are in the School of Business, correct? Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the term progressive taxation?
Vaguely.
Vaguely?
Vaguely. I don't teach that specific subject.
Well,
yeah.
but wait a minute. If you're in the School of, what is your degree in?
My degree is in business analytics, and my undergrad's in engineering.
So business analytics, you've never heard of progressive taxation?
I have absolutely heard of it.
Wait, and, what does progressive taxation mean?
It's a subject that I'm aware of, but I don't study it.
I didn't ask you if you studied it.
And
tell me what it's all about.
I could not define it if you asked me. And you did ask me.
I did ask you. Would you be surprised to learn that progressive taxation is a means of taxing the American populace that's based on the amount of income they made, so that the higher the income an individual makes, the greater the tax, so that proportionally we all pay, or are supposed to pay, a fair share.
Well, that makes sense.
It makes sense,
but it doesn't work that way.
Well, whether or not it works that way, there are tax sheets, right? Billionaires that run for office that pay nothing in tax. Is that what you're referring to?
That's exactly what I'm referring to.
I thought you were.
I want to be
We're
one of those people.
We're on the same page on that one. So the fact that those people cheat in many ways doesn't mean that the system is inappropriately conceived. It just means that there are people that are willing to cheat, correct?
I don't know if they cheat, do they?
I was born at night, but not last night.
That's a harder one to define.
Yes,
and a good one to debate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now that you have the concept of progressive taxation, would you consider that to be a fair way to tax the American people?
In theory, it absolutely is.
In theory. Why is it not a fair way to tax, period?
It doesn't work. It doesn't work the way we think it does.
No.
And so in theory, yes. In theory, it makes perfect sense. In practice, it doesn't.
Time out. Is the system of taxing individuals proportionally by the amount of income they make a fair system, yes or no?
I think it is.
Okay. So if it's good enough for tax purposes, why would you imagine that it is fair to ask less than 1% of the American population to carry 100% of the burden for our defense?
Because we're not in a situation where everyone has to serve. We're not in a situation where the country faces an existential threat. They're not comparable.
Not comparable.
Nope.
Are you familiar with the amount of mental illness that repeated deployments to war zones causes our military? Are you familiar with those statistics?
I'm very well
Was
aware.
that a
I'm
yes?
very well aware of that that exists. That phenomenon exists.
What phenomenon?
That repeated deployments do create systems or symptoms of increased stress on people, and it has been shown to show that.
And their families?
And their families, our families face difficulties too.
And the fact that less than 1% carry that burden doesn't give you any concern?
It has not ever given me any concern because most of us choose that. That's a choice that we make. So are we recruited? Are we enlisted? We make a choice. So when you, in an all-volunteer force, you make a choice, and you understand the consequences that come with those choices. So yes, I accept those. And I accept the fact that my family's been put under stress for an incredible amount of time in the same way that a lot of others do. And these are things that we talk about at home constantly, and the stress and the strain that has caused us. But that was a choice. That was my decision, and our decision as a family to do that.
Well, unlike in San Francisco, where my distinguished opponent has to pay over $200,000, did I hear you right, for a new lawyer to join your firm? What does a cup of coffee cost in San Francisco, for heaven's sakes? Well, here in Kansas, we have a different system, and throughout the rest of the country. I think it's important for you to perhaps address, do you know what the average income of recruits is before joining the military?
No, that's a good question. I don't.
And why do you think that's a good question?
Because you asked it. I'm curious. I'm curious what the answer is.
I call this man as my witness. Well, the fact is that a significant percentage of those that are recruited don't have the financial means to find, or the education to find employment that would give them a $60-some thousand bonus to join. So as a consequence, they're paying an immense sacrifice.
Are they? So I sit here today because of that very phenomenon.
Well,
because
but
my father was
you-
one who volunteered to fight in the Korean War
Mr.
for that very
Irigonegaray,
purpose, because he
your
couldn't
time is
find a
up.
job that would pay him.
I'm sorry, sir.
Oh, are we going to get cut off?
We are getting cut off.
Unfortunately, yes.
Thank you.
It's social mobility, and it's a great thing.
We are
And
cut
I'm here
off.
today because of my
We're
father.
cut off. Believe me, I could
get
go
out
all
somewhere.
day.
We will now proceed with our closing arguments, beginning with our affirmative or our negative from Mr. Duckers.
I think I should let Colonel Leonard close, or just keep talking, but thank you all again. You've heard a lot about this less than 1% of the people serving in the military. Well, that's what our military personnel needs are, less than 1% of the society. What you haven't heard the other side talk about, and in fact have seen them run like scalded dogs from, is the fact that that 1% of the people all chose to be there. They volunteered, they exercised their free will. And to go back to what Milton Friedman said on the Gates Commission, it is immoral to conscript men in a free society, and now women. They want to engage in an immoral act. The fact that there are only 1% of the population in the military just reflects military personnel needs. You're not going to change that. You know, we're not going to add 3, 4, 5 million people to military service that we don't need today. I don't think. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what their proposal is. We never got one from Dr. Raymond, and Colonel Benson gave us an outline of something that we could talk about, but we still don't know what they're talking about in terms of reinstating the draft. Is it everyone? Is it mandatory conscription at age 18 for every man, woman, and child in this country? Is that really what we want to do? And my good friend Pedro accuses me of engaging in hyperbole by talking about being forced into service at the point of the gun. But ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what a draft is. If you have a draft, it is illegal to dodge that draft. It is illegal not to serve. And if you choose to do that, some law enforcement officer is going to show up at your doorstep with a gun strapped on his hip and slap some handcuffs on you and take you to jail and prosecute you for draft evasion. Now, what do we, as a democratic, free society, prefer to have? Do we prefer to have a military full of men and women who chose to serve because they thought it was the best opportunity in their life? Or do we want a military full of men and women who were forced to be there at the point of a gun? To me, the answer to that is quite obvious. The other thing I would say that you've seen missing from the proponent's case is they have not made the case for needing additional manpower today. We've heard about existential threats and, oh my God, if there's another Pearl Harbor, we're going to need millions and millions of troops. Nobody disagrees with that. But we're talking about a peacetime draft, a permanent, full-time, forever peacetime draft that's not the product of existential risk or, world war. We agree, we'll have to call up more people if there's a war. There's no doubt about that. We're talking about a peacetime draft. And the case has not been made to you tonight that we need to add tens of thousands, even tens of thousands, much less hundreds of thousands or millions of conscripts every year to meet our military manpower needs. What you have heard, both from Colonel Benson and from Colonel Leonard, is that we need to reform the selective service system. The fact is, we couldn't implement a draft today if we wanted to, because the selective service system doesn't know who is between age 18 and 45 that could be drafted. If you went to the selective service system today and said, please draft me an equitable cohort of men and women to serve in the military service, the answer you'd get back is, we don't know, we can't find them. And it's easy to talk about how you would fix that, but think about how you would fix that. How are you going to track down a couple 100 million people who aren't registered after the fact? It wouldn't happen, so this draft would fall almost exclusively and disproportionately on young people. And another thing I'll mention, and I'm getting short on time, there is nothing more regressive. There is no more regressive tax than conscription, because you force people to work for less than their market value. Today there are recruiting bonuses that are paid and high salaries paid, and they're paid by the top 10% of income earners who pay 75% of the income tax. They're the ones who are paying the salaries of our military personnel. But if you force people to work and you don't pay them very much money, it's those people that are paying the tax. It's the difference between what they could earn in the market and what they're being paid under conscription, and it's falling on the less fortunate. It's great to think about some world where everybody serves, but you've heard the history of the draft. If we ever have a draft back, it's not going to be any more equitable or fair than it's ever been. The voluntary force is what's equitable and fair, because we give people the right to exercise their free will and make a choice about what they want to do with their life. Thank you very much.
Your Honor, Counselor, distinguished experts, my dear friends. If you look back in the back of this room, there stands the largest stained glass American flag in the world. The individual that this building is named for, the Institute, Robert Dole, was an individual that, like millions of other Americans, whether they volunteered or were drafted, saved our nation from the most horrific threat during World War II. Next to that beautiful flag are two columns that came down on September 11th as a consequence of what was at that time not an existential threat. But think of the damage it caused. There's a plaque by that flag that I think is most appropriate for me to use. Flying the largest stained glass American flag in the world. I should use the word flanking, not flying. My writing, I can't even read my writing sometimes. Flanking the largest stained glass American flag in the world, like sentinels of honor, are two beams that form part of the World Trade Center, destroyed on September 11th, 2001. Dedicated to the memory of those we lost on that day, of honor and heroism. They also remind us that each generation faces its call to service. This is not a matter of how many dollars. It's not a matter of anything other than the safety of our republic. Fairness, equity. And no matter how we sugarcoat it, less than 1% of our fellow citizens are carrying that burden. Less than 1%. They're being driven to mental health crises, staggering losses. Those individuals don't come from the wealthiest class of Americans. Those individuals are not from families that cannot give their sons and daughters the benefit of wealth. They are the lower middle class and the lower class of our fellow citizens. So no matter how much we sugarcoat it, fairness, equity demands that we share in the responsibility for the future of our nation, for our safety, and the safety of the world. Because we are the last bastion of liberty. Let's not forsake our freedom, our safety, because we make believe everything is okay. We don't have to worry about it. There's not an existential threat. Everything's going to be fine. It's too difficult to fix. It's too difficult to correct the problem. Overwhelmingly difficult. Well, that's not nearly as difficult as losing your freedom. And I can tell you what that is like, because I'm a political refugee in this country, because my nation of Cuba was reckless in its national defense. Don't let that happen to America. We have no other place to go. Thank you.
Well, what a program. I'll ask the audience to join me in thanking our wonderful counselors and expert witnesses. And can I also get a round of applause for our wonderful timekeepers who kept us on track tonight? I hope you all enjoyed the program, and we thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for attending, and have a great night.
Come here.
Secretary of Defense cannot wash his hands off.